Well, good morning, friends. Every now and then, I hear a sermon and I wonder, why didn't I think of that? It happens a lot. They're amazing messages drawn from a single verse or two that most of us read right over when we're reading our Bibles. Often, we don't read the verses that are not well known. We rush past them to get to the passages that we're familiar with, that bring us comfort and hope. As an example, there's a well-known passage in Revelations chapter 21. We often hear it on All Saints' Day. Sometimes it's used to bring comfort to those who grieve at a funeral service. And although it is not our sermon text for today, I'm going to begin with it because it's one of those passages that we're drawn to that may cause us to skip the things around it. And of course, I'm talking about that beautiful passage from Revelations 21 about God wiping away the tears from our eyes. It goes like this. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." It's a beautiful passage, and it's one that many of us have heard before. But John continues describing this vision of the New Jerusalem and his encounter with an angel who had a yardstick. And so 10 verses later in this very same chapter, starting at verse 15, we hear these two verses, which are the focus of our text today. The angel who talked to me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city and its gates and walls. The city lies 4 square, its length the same as its width, and he measured the city with his rod, 1,500 miles. Its length and width and height are equal. Now you might wonder, why on earth would a preacher focus on the measurements of Jerusalem when she could dwell on the earlier passage about no more pain and no more death and God wiping away our tears? It's a fair question, but it's one that the Apostle Paul answered just perfectly when he wrote that all Scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness. Did you hear that? All Scripture. So it's important for us to read and to dig deeper and to study and learn and interpret all of what the Bible contains. I know it's easier to read familiar passages, and I understand that digging deeper often forces us to encounter contradictions and challenges. Too often, I read over those passages about measurements or long lists of names or how the temple was built to get to the meaty stuff I'm familiar with. And maybe you do the same thing. But when I do that, I miss some important ideas, and maybe you do too. So let me read part of today's text again. The city lies 4 square, its length the same as its width, and he measured the city with his rod, 1,500 miles. Its length and width and height are equal. I'm pretty sure that the size of the city was not the point of this text. Instead, the balance between the length, the width, and the height is what matters. They were equal. So we ask the question, why does this matter? And why is it included in Holy Scripture? Well, during Advent, if you think back to December, Pastor Don preached a message called Behind the Curtain, using text from the book of Revelations. And he taught us that Sunday that we shouldn't read Revelations literally, that many of its images and figures and stories and storyline are designed to be used as allegories or metaphors to help us understand how we are to apply the Bible to our lives. And I think this passage about the measurements of Jerusalem is like that. Its equal length, width, and height is an image or metaphor that gives us a blueprint for how to live our lives according to the greatest commandment and its companion commandment that Jesus taught us when he was speaking to people who were questioning about which commandment is most important. And he replied to them saying, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." If we read loving ourselves as the length, we read loving our neighbor as width, we read loving God as height, the verse offers us a divine blueprint for how to apply Jesus' commands to love God and then love ourselves and our neighbors. So let's start with length, or love of self. Now this may seem the opposite of Jesus' self-sacrificing love. But I don't think that Jesus saying that we should love our neighbors as we love ourselves means that we should be self-centered or self-indulgent. I think instead Jesus was reminding us to love that divine image within us and to let that divine image overcome all of those worldly characteristics that we so easily assume. I think he was also reminding us that we need to love the gifts that we're given. Those spiritual gifts, those talents that we have, instead of wishing we had someone else's gifts. Now, I admit, I spend a fair amount of time wishing I had other people's gifts. I mean, I wish I could sing like Allison. And when I look at Cindy Pratt, I wish I had her patience. I wish I could ride a bike as fast as she does. And I wish I could bake bread like her. But the truth of the matter is, my voice is kind of like Kermit the Frog with a sore throat, and you should give Dr. Don a bonus for having to stand next to me when we sing on Sunday morning. I ride my bike like a tortoise rather than a hare, and a few loaves of bread I made could have been used as doorstops, if I'm honest. The idea of accepting ourselves, though, with all of our strengths and weaknesses, really hits home to me when I think about our handy-capable congregation. The last couple Ash Wednesdays, one of our handy singers led us in the song, "I Got the Joy, 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 Joy Down in My Heart." She uses the gifts God has given her to be joyful, and she shares her gift of singing, and in it, she glorifies God. When I think of liking the gifts that we have and accepting the gifts we have, it reminds me of a poem by a man named Douglas Mallock. It expresses this idea of accepting who you are and what you have. That doesn't mean we don't try to overcome weaknesses that aren't Christ-like, but accept the gifts we have. And the poem is called "Be the Best of Whatever You Are." It's kind of a nice poem really to raise children with, but I'm going to share it with us anyway because we just sang that we were sons and daughters of God, so we're children too. If you can't be a pine on the top of the hill, be a scrub in the valley, but be the best little scrub by the side of the rill. Be a brush if you can't be the tree. If you can't be a highway, then just be a trail. If you can't be the sun, be a star. It isn't by size that you win or you fail. Be the best of whatever you are. That captures loving yourself. Simply accept your God-given gifts, but don't stop there. Once you've accepted them, cultivate them and use them to serve your neighbors, which brings us to the second dimension, which is width. It seems like loving our neighbors is best represented by width. We think of Jesus with his arms reached out toward the children, saying, "Let the little children come to me." Or more somberly, we think of Jesus with his arms stretched out on the cross, bridging the gap so that we as broken humans can be reconciled to God. I'm not going to dwell a lot on loving neighbors right now. I'll come back to it a little bit later, but The reason I'm not dwelling on it a lot is because this church offers ministries to many ages, inside and outside our walls, to care for our neighbors. The idea of loving our neighbors should be informed, though, by Jesus' teaching on the subject, perhaps best remembered by the parable of the Good Samaritan. This is a difficult teaching. With this parable, Jesus is saying, look, sometimes your enemy is actually your neighbor. And religious piety doesn't excuse you from caring for a neighbor in need. Period. He was very direct when he said that we were to love all our neighbors. If you ever saw Yvette Carter interact with our clients at Open Arms, you saw that kind of loving your neighbor in person. Now, I saved height for last because the idea for this sermon actually came from another pastor who I have come to admire, and that's where he placed it. But when I first read his message, I thought, height, or loving God, that should have been first. And it shouldn't be equal, it should be more than the other loves. I don't think I agree with this pastor. But I thought about it. I thought about it a lot. And I was wrong, because initially I thought the blueprint should be like a skyscraper, square at the bottom, but taller than it is wide, taller than length, because we should love God more. But as I thought about the sermon, I came to realize a couple of things. Organizationally, the original preacher saved the best for last, and so I have too. And second, real love for self and neighbor come much more easily and grow in capacity as we love God. I'm not sure that a single focused love on God and only God is really love at all. That is not how our Trinitarian God exists. Father, Son, and Spirit, Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer, exists three in one. It's complicated, but they exist in relationships, so we remember how important relationships and loving one another the same way that the Holy Trinity has relationship and love within it. It's a hard concept to grasp, and the best way I can share it with you is to tell you a story. It's a true story. Didn't happen here at St. Paul. It happened before I came here back in the 2009 or 2010 time frame. It's about my husband, Bruce, rest his soul. I had a conversation with him. He went to church with me one day at East Lake United Methodist Church, where the pastor preached that we are to love God more than anyone else, even our children, even our spouse. We are to love God most. And we were perhaps taking his message a little more literally than he intended it. But anyway, I got home and I went back to our bedroom in the evening, and I found my husband sitting on the edge of the bed, kind of teary-eyed. And I said, honey, what's wrong? And he said, well, I heard what Bob said today, and I don't want to love anyone more than I love you. And I don't want you to love anyone more than you love me. Now, I hadn't had the benefit of seminary or thinking about that question very much. So I answered him with my very best Forrest Gump impression by saying, loving other people without loving God first is like an apple pie. An apple pie comes in a plate. It has limits. The plate can only hold so much pie. You cut up the pieces and you give them out, and when it's gone, it's gone. But when you love God first, it's like the pie plate falls away, and you have this limitless supply of apple pie, or love. And when we love God first, it increases our capacity to love so much that we have even more love to give other people and to love ourselves with than we had before we loved God first. It wasn't necessarily terribly theologically sophisticated, but was the best I had in 2010. And my husband, true to form, looked at me and he rolled his eyes. And he laughed and he said, well, just make sure I get a big piece of that pie, okay? And that, those of you who knew Bruce, you can imagine that. My takeaway is simply that real love of God expands our capacity to love and accept ourselves, and perhaps more importantly, to love and accept other people, to recognize God's image contained within us, and more importantly, to recognize God's imprint on everyone else, especially those who are different from us. This life of the three balanced dimensions makes sense to me, and I hope it makes sense to you, because loving God, self, and neighbor isn't an option. It was command. Jesus commanded it in Matthew 22. You can read it for yourself. He said, this is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is just like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. This linking of our rather obscure sermon text about measuring the New Jerusalem with the greatest commandments didn't come from me. Last year, I decided to do some reading by a pastor who I have come to admire in the last few years. I bought a book called Message from a Birmingham Jail that contained an essay written by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King when he was jailed during the Civil Rights Movement. And as a bonus, a message that I am paraphrasing very roughly today was in the back half of that book. I think it's important because we really can't love our neighbors if we're not willing to listen and learn from the neighbors who are different than we are. Too often we close our eyes and our ears to those whose skin is a different color, whose voices have a different accent. But the last few years, I've been intentional about reading books by people of color, and I've learned a lot about my own biases and privilege. And that's kind of why I didn't tell you at the beginning that I was sort of stealing a sermon idea from Dr. King. Because I remember a day not that long ago, if I had been in church or at a prayer breakfast or something, and someone started talking about Dr. King, I might have tuned them out, thinking, well, Dr. King was a good man, but he was a black man. He came from a different kind of church than mine. I mean, he's not relevant to me. I don't need to listen to what he had to say. And to tell you the truth, I was really way wrong, and I wasn't even recognizing my own bias at the time. It's taken me a long time to realize that to love my neighbors, I have to spend more time listening to neighbors who are different than me. We celebrate Martin Luther King's birthday, and we celebrate Black History Month because honoring different cultures and all kinds of different people will help us love neighbors who come from a farther distance than our own little city block. God's kingdom, after all, is a big, beautiful neighborhood where love prevails and where everyone, all colors, all nationalities, all genders, all reflect God's divine image. I give thanks to Dr. King for this little message that I read this summer because he reminded me of three very important things. First, don't skip anything when you're reading the Bible. There's wonderful stuff in there worthy of pondering and learning from. Second, he reminded me how important it is when I choose what to read that I choose my readings from a very diverse population of people so that I can learn and grow in my relationships with people of all kinds. And lastly, he reminded me how important the greatest commandment and its companion are. Especially today, when powerful forces believe that racial jokes are okay. And when divided opinions encourage us to fear, to hate, and to demand that everyone conform to the cultural priorities of the majority, instead of living like Jesus. Our Creator built us using a divine blueprint. God pulled out his divine tape measure and built us to love God, love ourselves, and love our neighbor in proper proportions. But the world is trying very hard to do a remodeling job on what God built. And my prayer for us today is that the divine blueprint will prevail. The angel with the ruler reminds us to love God with all our heart, our mind, and our strength. To love the divine image we can see in ourselves if we look hard enough when we're looking in the mirror. And to use the gifts God has given us to love and recognize the divine image in all people. All people. I pray this morning to that divine builder, God, let it be so.